like to mention first in 1990s when I started journalism career. I started in press, in print media. My career started in 1993. In those times, I just wanted to remember that the ownership structures of media was changing. We began to have, before then, Turkey used to have media owners who has journalistic background in their families. But with the 1990s, now business people began to get hold of these media companies. We can some other time we can discuss the reasons, but these business-minded people, which gradually became conglomerates and just think of in business mindedness. I mean, they didn't think about the public good. So I just wanted to remind you about that. But one issue, especially, I would like to highlight from that times is that is regarding the precarization of journalistic work, and it started in the 1990s. Though we nowadays talk about precarization more often. In Turkey, I think in journalism, precarization of the journalistic work started in the 1990s. During those periods, especially after a limited number of conglomerates I mentioned began to dominate the media market, unionization was discouraged and prevented. The number of journalists employed within the scope of press labor law became scarce, and there was not much job security left for us due to increasing irregular, even unregistered employment, and of course there was great labor exploitation. So I wanted to mention this because the fear of being fired, invites a culture of self-censorship as well. So we had this as a culture in our media environment, starting from 1990s. Another fear that makes journalists prone to the censorship, as you know, is of death and violence, and especially in the 1990s, beginning of 1990s, it was acute, the violence against media workers. According to Turkish Journalists Association, 67 journalists were killed between 1909 to this date, and 1/3 of them, a total of 22 journalists, were killed within 2 years, between 1992 and 1993. This was, very violent atmosphere to be a journalist. And also we remember Uğur Mumcu, for example, assassination, because we commemorate that. But most of the time at the time were Kurdish journalists or working for Kurdish press. And also in 1994, the office and printing house of, again, pro-Kurdish newspaper Özgür Ülke were bombed. So I think it was, this fear also helped a new culture that you internalize censorship in a way, because it was very difficult to be investigative journalists. But when we come to the beginnings of the beginning of 2000 is, I think, we had this relative freedom of press. It was wonderful for me, especially because in 1999, though we had an earthquake and political instability and an economic crisis between 1999 and till the AKP come to power, it was the start of this 24 hours news channels. And this I started to work for CNN Turkey, and then after 2 years I passed to the NTV, and we had this freedom because we had these live coverages. Especially I wanted to mention because we could be doing, we were doing critical coverages. I especially wanted to mention one from CNN Turk regarding the prison operations in 1999. We had this live coverage. We showed everything what's going on, the state violence against these prisoners, all of that. And also in the 2002, when I was working for the NTV, it was just before the Iraqi war, and I remember our also coverage helped this pro-war, pro-peace stance, or although the AKP leadership was wanted to have American forces to pass through Turkey for this war effort, and I think it was critical in that sense. I would not go further, but I would like I'd like to say that this relative freedom of press media, I think, began 2007 was critical for that. From that on, we began to lose this freedom gradually at first. Then it went much more faster, as we will talk maybe later on.
Yes, I think I would like to pick it up right here with the year 2007, because that is fundamental in understanding the decline in media freedom over the past more than a decade. And our research done in a number of countries beyond Turkey, Eastern Europe, but in other countries, shows that was a combination of the financial crisis, which had a major impact on many media outlets. You remember probably the slashing of the advertising budgets, the sale of many media companies, and all that, and the rise of new technologies, which in many countries, many media outlets were not maybe ready to embrace them. You remember the spread of the Google-based advertising sale model. You remember how the social media started to become major players in the advertising market and markets and all that. And that had a major impact on what we had today. And this is going to the heart of your question, I think, about the democratic backsliding, because a major pillar or element of this democratic backsliding is the worsening of the media freedom situation in many of these countries. I think there is a direct link between that and the overall decline in the quality of democracies. And what we have now, and this is where I want to make the distinction between what we had before. I agree that there were periods for example, in some countries in Eastern Europe that saw independent journalism thriving because of the entry of foreign investors and because of the rise of many media outlets that were operating independently. But we also had at the time lots of problems in many media markets. The issue of concentration of ownership existed many decades ago. Problems with how regulation was politicized in many countries existed before. So the question now is, why are we now worse off than we were back then? And why we are, in fact, is because what we are going through is what we discussed before, which is this phenomenon of media capture, which is an unprecedented phenomenon consisting of the rise of business structures that operate in tandem with state authorities in capturing media outlets. We'll probably touch on this topic a lot during the conversation. So the question, what do we have today, and how spread what's the spread of this decline in media freedom? I think it is worse than we've ever experienced in the modern era. But we have to distinguish between various groups of countries, so to speak, because first of all, we have a number of factors. We have legislation, for example, that is in many countries encroaching upon independence of the media. We have the financial crisis was a huge factor that actually led to an increased vulnerability of the media, and that's why many got bought, because they suffered financially, and oligarchic structures or other people started to buy media outlets. So we have a number of factors, and I'm sure you are totally familiar with them. But what's really important to say is that where this model led was a spread of the propaganda model that we have in many of these countries. I think that the countries that Bilge mentioned from the Freedom House studies fit very well that pattern. We have the rise this propaganda model in many of these places. And in parallel, we have seen a shrinking space for independent journalism, and that is the most, I think that is the most dramatic change in how we operate, how journalism operate, because the shrinking space is actually the biggest and the most dramatic consequence of the media capture. And this is the situation we have today. We can speak a lot about that and give lots of examples. As I said, we have to distinguish, I believe, between various groups of countries, because we have on the one hand groups of countries like China or North Korea, or where things haven't actually improved much. If you look at them, there was no democracy first of all to start with. Then you have countries where that passed the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, where there was a lot of hope that they will evolve towards democracy, and there was a decade of democracy in the 90s, but then we have started to already see this democratic backsliding. So you have a variety of countries, but what is really important is this decline in media freedom. And I believe that's the short answer to your question. I believe that the media capture is the root of those problems. And I'll just finish with a study, because part of the problem and the reason why we have this rise of the propaganda model is because of the overwhelming and again unprecedented rise of the role of the governments in the media in various ways, by funding media outlets, by controlling media outlets, by setting up media outlets, governing media outlets, and so on. And at the end of the day, there is nothing wrong with governments funding journalism, because governments fund arts, culture. Is actually great to have public resources going into the media. But the problem we have here is use of public resources to control the media outlets. That is the problem we are talking about, and that goes again at the heart of the media capture. And I was saying that I will finish with this study. We published last year a study covering 150 countries in the world, focusing specifically on state media. And we try to analyze various aspects of their work. The study is packed with details about, for example, how they are funded, how they are governed and managed, how they are controlled editorially, if they are or not. And of course, you have a lot of findings. But what was really, in a way, shocking was that 80% of all the state media outlets in these countries that we mapped in the world lack editorial independence.
Again, just to lay the groundwork, by media capture, we refer to how media organizations, media outlets become subject to or are captured by, technically captured by powerful elite or class interests, right? So in media capture, a couple of points are worthy of mention. The first one is the concentration of media ownership in the hands of the few, right? The economic elite. And Işın already talked about how this started to transpire, like in the 1990s, right? And what happens when media ownership is concentrated in the hands of the few? We see biased coverage, we see low levels of political accountability, we see corrupt relationships between governments and media owners. Again, in Turkey, we have, unfortunately, so many stories, of these kinds of relationships. And this goes back, further to the mainstream right governments in the 1990s, the coalition governments in the 1990s, right? And as a result of media capture, we witness the declining of the news media's watchdog function, right? Because there is politicized coverage, because the information, news and information are manipulated according to the ruling government's political agenda, right? And this capture can occur in direct and indirect control mechanisms. So obviously, direct control mechanism is the actual capturing or taking over of a media organization, the closing down of a media organization, the transfer of the assets of the media organization to the state agencies. But indirect control mechanisms are also important tools that anti-democratic actors avail themselves of. So state subsidies or bailouts or preferential distribution of state advertising or tax breaks for media owners, right? So given all these tax breaks, credits, cheap credits from state banks, privatization deals, state subsidies, right? We are all very familiar with examples from recent years in Turkey, as you have mentioned, like the pool media, like where they come together and pool their resources to toe the Erdogan government's line, but also pooling, in another sense of the word, pooling, like all these state sources, right? And in this case, we're talking about, like these huge conglomerates in construction, energy, business, finance, you name it. So while these, tax credits, privatization deals, cheap credits from state banks, they are, like doled out to government-friendly or pro-government actors, right? They are also withheld from critical media outlets. And I think this has been, a very important turning point in Turkey. And I think it was 2014, there was a report about how pro-government media companies have hugely benefited from, like state advertising, whereas these state advertisements were, like withheld from critical media outlets. And again, this brings me back to what Marius has said about the importance of, like the financial crisis and technological changes in the media landscape. So especially, like during those times when media outlets find themselves under increasing pressure because they're losing advertising revenue to, social media or, like web-based news outlets, and, like even Google or Facebook. So advertising revenue from traditional, advertisers become ever more important for them, right? Turn into a lifeline. So when, for example, in Turkey, state banks or big companies that are, like somehow under state control, like, Turkish Airlines and even, like big municipalities, right? They are also big advertising spenders. When they, funnel their advertising advertising dollars to particular pro-government newspapers or news outlets, news media, and withhold them from others, that means, like the decimation of government critical outlets. Just to, like say a few things about this kind of, like long trajectory of media capture. Again, I think it's important to recognize that, like this didn't happen overnight. Yes, 2007, 2008 are, like critical turning points. But I would even go back further a little bit. After AKP came to power in 2002, it's also started to, capitalize on the government, on the economic crisis that happened in 2001. So as you'll remember, like there was a huge banking and financial crisis. Again, this goes back to what Marius said about, the import of financial crisis on media system and media actors, right? So the AKP kind of took advantage of this banking crisis that occurred in 2001, and starting in 2002, it started to deploy TMSF, what we call in Turkish Tasarruf Mevduat Sigorta Fonu. It's the Savings Deposit Insurance Fund. So it's a government agency that operated under the Prime Minister's office. And because the major banks, collapsed, their media companies under their control also collapsed, right? So this wasn't just, I think, a banking crisis, but it was also, like a media sector crisis. So TMSF, the Savings Deposit Insurance Fund, started to take over these, collapsed banks and the newspapers, television channels, and radio stations that they controlled. And then after a market evaluation, they sold them off, right? So after this, right, the TMSF operations, by 2006, the media landscape had changed considerably, right? Major media companies such as Bilgin and Uzan, that they kind of had been eliminated, right, because of their financial troubles. And we witnessed the emergence of new players such as Doğuş and Ciner, right? But I think the Most visible example of media capture by way of TMSF was in 2008 when they sold Star newspaper and Kanal 24, right, the news channel, to the AKP-friendly Sancak Holding, right? So this was a complicated process of expropriation, sales, resales, right? It took several years. And then in 2011, TMSF, the insurance fund under the Prime Minister's office, under Erdogan's control practically, they took over Sabah ATV, which was one of the largest television newspaper enterprises in Turkey. And they cited some criminal charges based on, like past financial transactions between its old and new owners, etc. Long story short, Sabah ATV was sold to the AKP-friendly Çalık Holding. And at the time, the CEO of the company was Erdogan's son-in-law. So this, I think, was, like the beginning of the cultivation of a pro-government friendly media bloc, right? And in 2009, of course, we need to mention the tax levies imposed on, Doğan Media by Ministry of Finance. Again, this was kind of like a coercive measure that was used on media, mainstream media. So this was kind of, like one stone, two birds situation, because it on one hand, they imposed this huge levy, like $500 million, and then later approximately $3 billion, which in, like total, like it was almost equal of the entire company's assets, right? That was a huge blow. So on one hand, they use these tax evasion charges to kind of, like silence Doğan Media. But on the other hand, they also taught a very valuable lesson, so to speak, to other media outlets, right? As if to say, like, look, this could be happening to you too. So that's another important, I think, turning point. And obviously, while all of this is happening, between 2008 and 2011, there are the, like politicized investigations, Ergenekon and Sledgehammer, and not only, like military officers and, like political dissidents are jailed, but also journalists, right? And civil society actors.
I would like to tell that why we had one point regarding why we felt much more freer at the start of the 2000s. Why? An important factor that I should mention that in December 1999, Turkey was officially recognized as a candidate for full membership of European Union. Of course, this was not only this was a changing game, I mean, game changer, but also it was giving hope for all the Turkish public as well. I mean, the future will be brighter if we can get to the European Union. We will be living in much more better in economically, democratically. We will have much more polarization. And so as media workers, we were sharing this hope. And we were optimistic, and we were working, we were trying to function really, that Bilge beautifully mentioned, that this watchdog function that we forgot. We try to do it with this new, optimism in a better way.
Let me first refer to media capture also in terms of its logic and its components. And what I mean here is the fact that, because I mentioned some minutes ago the difference between tendencies like concentration of ownership or politicized regulation, politicized state media that we always had. But what we have now is a different phenomenon where you actually see as Birge defined it, groups of interest, elites taking control of many parts of the media field. And our question as researchers was, what exactly happens? So we try to actually, point at the exact parts of the media ecosystem that are being controlled, and we try to understand the reason for that. When it comes to reason, let me start with that. There is a logic, so to speak, of the media capture. That's why the phenomenon is it has more impact than tendencies before of concentration and all that on independent journalism, because it has a logic. And part of this logic, we noticed that, for example, before like roughly 1 year or so before elections, you see tendencies related to capture. You see governments or companies close to the government starting to buy more media outlets. You see governments spending more money in the state media and so on. And the logic there is purely electoral, because the whole media capture system that is built and is focused on the independence of media outlets is focused on ensuring that you win the elections. That is very important to understand, because these elites, the whole stake in the game for them is to make sure that they do not lose elections, because if they lose elections, they lose access to resources. So this is the end of the story, and we have to really understand that the phenomenon through this lens and through that logic. If we understand that, then we try to check a model on various countries and understand what exactly is being captured and where do you have capture. And we came up with a model that has been we published a number of articles and academic papers about that. We noticed that there is a correlation, for example, between 4 things. One is regulation. The second is state funding that is being spent, as it was already said, preferentially to media outlets in the form of state advertising in most cases. The third is the state media or public media, so control over that is important. And the fourth is control of private ownership. The fourth one is very important because that is most difficult to achieve. The other 3 are quite easy. If you win elections, if you win the political power, you can immediately appoint your own people at the public media. You can immediately appoint your own people in the regulatory bodies, and you can immediately make decisions about state funding, where it goes. But with ownership, there is a problem, and that was the most difficult way to achieve, because you deal with private owners. In many cases, these are foreign owners with their own rules. It's very hard to actually push them out, but in the end, it happens through various ways. So just to summarize, when you have these 4 elements in place, you have a media capture environment. If you miss one, you don't actually have capture, because if you miss control either of the public media. In some countries, that is a very important player. If you do not own a lot of the private media outlets, again, you don't have the power that you need to win the elections. And the last thing that I want to mention is that usually in all the cases we looked, the trend is not to acquire all the private media. There is a tendency, if you look at all the countries and examples of media capture, where at some point they stop. They don't need, if they see that they have like the critical mass, 70% of the private media, they stop. Enough votes, enough media power, we stop there. And of course, they study the media market in the next elections and so on.